Welcome to National Parks Traveler, where we explore the national parks and the issues that involve them.
From Maine to Florida, coastal units of the national park system are being impacted in various ways by the changing climate. Some of the impacts affect wildlife, some natural resources, and some the human populations who either live in or come to visit these beautiful areas. This is Kurt Repenchek, your host at the National Parks Traveler. We've been working on a series of stories looking at these changes that are showing up in the parks. In recent shows, we've discussed the impacts to manatees that live in the waters of Everglades and Biscayne National Parks, as well as Cumberland Island National Seashore, and how sea level rise is impacting salt marshes that are vital for wildlife and which serve as buffers to hurricanes and tropical storms. At Acadia National Park in Maine, the impacts are materializing in various ways. Rainstorms are becoming heavier and more damaging. Invasive species such as the Asian shore crab are showing up in the waters of Frenchman Bay, and the number of bird species that winter on Mount Desert Island have decreased greatly. To take a closer look at these changes, we're joined by Nick Fisichella, the president and CEO of the Schoodic Institute, a nonprofit science center based on the National Park's Schoodic Peninsula, to discuss some of the impacts that have arrived and the research being done to better understand them. We'll be back in a minute with Nick.
The Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation is the primary nonprofit fundraising partner for the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is made up of people who have a deep love for this majestic road and want to ensure that its natural beauty and the experiences it offers endure for generations to come. You can show your appreciation at brpfoundation.org. Smokey's Life, full of stunning photography and thought-provoking reads, Smokey's Life Journal is a biannual magazine produced by Smokey's Life, formerly the Great Smoky Mountains Association. Members receive it free of charge each spring and fall, and it is available for purchase in retail stores throughout Great Smoky Mountains National Park and online at smokieslife.org. Acadia National Park is one of the 10 most popular national parks in the United States. It is also one of the smallest and most vulnerable. That's why Friends of Acadia exists. Friends of Acadia is an independent organization of passionate people inspiring those who love this magnificent park to make a real and lasting difference for Acadia. You can make a difference too at friendsofacadia.org. Listener and reader support make the National Parks Traveler possible every day of the year. If you enjoy the Traveler's content, please consider a donation at nationalparkstraveler.org.
Welcome back to the Traveler, Nick.
Thanks for having me, Kurt.
You know, I appreciate your time. You're right there in the Schoodic Institute on the Schoodic Peninsula of Acadia National Park, a gorgeous place to be located. I'm envious. I was there once. I want to come back. But you're also at a location where you can really, on the ground level, view of what climate change is doing to Acadia National Park and the landscapes and the marinescapes around it.
We are, yes. Yeah, it's a fantastic, beautiful landscape and seascape. It's a place of change, and it's also a transition zone. It's a transition between the temperate forests to the boreal forest to the north, and also from the eastern Gulf of Maine to the western Gulf of Maine, and from the coast to inland as well. And so we are definitely seeing a lot of changes happening here. And in Acadia, there's been science happening here since actually before the creation of the park. So there's more than 140 years of people really documenting this place. And thus we're able to build upon that work and really understand the changes happening here.
So, Nick, we keep hearing that the Gulf of Maine is the fastest warming body of water in the world. I mean, is that accurate? And what are the impacts related to that?
Yeah, that's my understanding as well. Scientists that have been studying Gulf of Maine, it do show from the data that yeah, it's warming faster than 99% of the world's oceans. And it seems like, from my understanding on that, this is changes in the currents that feed the Gulf with a weakening of the cold water current and a strengthening of some of the warm water inputs into the Gulf. And then, along with the warming of the waters, we're seeing ocean acidification, sea level rise, and then of course, warming air temperatures and changes in the precipitation regime here, and especially a lot more heavy rain events. So those are, some of the physical changes that are happening. We're seeing lots of biological changes too, certainly increases in some species like European green crabs, Asian shore crabs just recently arrived on the Scudic Peninsula, actually been detected by citizen scientists and middle school groups that are helping with some of the science happening in Acadia. And this place, it's a transition zone in many ways. So on land as well, there's concerns about the forests of Acadia. Over the last decade or so, most of the red pine have been lost from the park because of invasive pest species. Recently, hemlock woolly adelgid arrived as well, another tree pest species, and beech leaf disease just arrived within the last year or so. And so, you layer all of these things on top of a changing climate, and there are rapid changes underway.
Yeah, you just pointed to a bunch of impacts that are coming or that have already reached Acadia and the surrounding landscape up there. You mentioned you're seeing heavier precipitation, snow or rain.
As as a skier, I wish it was snow. Unfortunately, here on the coast of Maine, it's a lot of rain. This past winter, it was more rain, less snow. There are the wonderful carriage roads in the park, and this winter, I think, was the first time that in that people can remember that there wasn't enough snow to groom for cross-country skiing on the carriage roads in the park. And so we're definitely seeing more rain year round, but especially in wintertime. And then heavy rain events. So more of these 2-inch and 3-inch plus rainfall events, which of course, cause flooding and impacts. And you think about infrastructure in the park, culverts that were, put in place 100 years ago that weren't designed for the magnitude of rain that we're getting today.
Yeah, no, it's incredible. And as you said, the culvert situation, I mean, as I understand it, they're having to replace culverts that are just too small, can't handle all the runoff. And, that's got to be an incredible problem in terms of roads and trails and whatnot. And does the park have the resources, the financial resources, the manpower resources to stay on top of replacing those and getting bigger culverts in?
That's of course always a challenge with park management having sufficient resources. I think we're seeing greater strains happening because of the all of the impacts that are happening and the acceleration of impacts. The recent bipartisan infrastructure law and Inflation Reduction Act are bringing in more resources to help in the response. And so in some places, culverts are being replaced to help improve hydrology, to improve fish passage, as well as visitor experience trails and carriage roads, et cetera, in the park. So those have been very valuable and ongoing projects and sources of funding, but certainly we're going to need to continue and keep up that level of support as change continues and accelerates.
Yeah, yeah. Now, I appreciate the fact that you're at the Scudic Institute and you're not part of the National Park Service staff, but you're a very close bystander. I'm just wondering, we've heard about all these studies that the Park Service has been doing to look at climate change and explore climate change adaptation and mitigation. Is that work keeping up with the needs on the ground? And by that, I'm wondering if, you know, some of those studies could take years to complete and reach conclusions. And already you've got the impacts on the ground. I mean, is there a convergence there or a disruption there?
Yeah, that's a great question and observation on that, Kurt. And yeah, so Scudic Institute, we're a nonprofit science and education partner organization. And our role is to really bring the science to help support the stewardship in the park. And we're trying to shift the model of that. There was the old model that science is kind of done on its own, and the findings are then published, and then managers pick up a journal, look at the study, and then use that to inform management. And we know that one, that model really doesn't work, and two, the changes are happening so fast that managers can't wait. And so, one of our roles as a science partner is to make sure that we're co-producing the science with the managers and doing so sort of in real time together, and trying to implement a learn while doing approach so that we are testing multiple climate adaptation approaches for simultaneously as part of these restoration projects that are happening here in Acadia, and really trying to build a portfolio of approaches to understand both what's going to be effective today, but also what's going to be effective in the long term as conditions continue to change.
Right, right. Now, I was fortunate, as I mentioned earlier, to come out to Scudic back in 2019 during an event there at the Institute, and you were gracious with your time. And you toured me around, and we went up to Cadillac Mountain, where you're trying to encourage some restoration work because of all the people that go up there and what that does to the soil. But you also pointed out a test plot, if you will, to see what type of vegetation might be adaptable to Acadia in the event that you lose all your red spruce, for instance. What are you learning from that test plot?
Yeah, so that was what we call the tree test bed study, where we're looking at, really trying to better understand the future forest, which species are going to do well, which are going to struggle under emerging conditions. As I mentioned before, Acadia is in this transition zone between warm adapted temperate forest and cold adapted boreal forest. And so 2 out of every 3 trees in the park is a cold adapted tree species that's projected to struggle under emerging conditions. But exactly how that plays out, which species and when, remains a huge uncertainty. Right now, as I mentioned, there's beech leaf disease in the park, which just showed up, sort of out of nowhere here in New England. And beech trees, just based on climate alone, should have suitable habitat, into the foreseeable future. And yet that species now is suddenly struggling because of this other pest. And so part of our work is to try to better, understand through on-the-ground tests, looking at survival and growth of different tree species to help managers better understand these changes and which species may be able to do well into the future.
And of course, if you lose a tree species, you also risk losing the other species that rely on that species of tree, right? And one thing that comes to mind are some of your bird species there that might lose a habitat because changing vegetation or warming climate.
Right, absolutely. About 40% of the trees in Acadia are red spruce. It's a cold adapted species that likes cool, wet conditions. And as we're seeing more hot and dry days, especially during the summer, there's a lot of questions about whether it'll be able to persist. Right now, it's doing great. It's a happy tree, so to speak, here in Acadia. But there's questions, and in the science and the research, there's a lot of questions about its ability to adapt to these changing conditions. And as an evergreen, a conifer, it's amazing habitat for a whole suite of bird species and migratory warblers that nest here in the park. And in fact,
Mhm.
some of the seminal research was done in the past looking at resource partitioning by warblers in spruce trees.
Yeah. And, the warbler is just one species that's possibly at risk depending on, which way the weather goes. But there was a study not too long ago that said since 1971, there's been a drastic decline of winter bird populations seen at Acadia. I believe it was a 43% reduction in the total number of birds seeing in the park during the winter months over the last 50 years. That's got to be that's mind-boggling almost to have such a decline.
It is. It really is. Yes. Yeah, at that level. And that's, again, thanks to citizen scientists that have been paying attention, birders who are really, really dedicated, we're able to, detect these patterns over, these scales of time that are much longer than, for example, I've been here working in Acadia. And yeah, some of the really what used to be super abundant species are now, much more scarce here in the park, and it's and in the waters around the park as well. And so some of that is due to the changes in the Gulf of Maine that you mentioned earlier as well. So seabird populations such as common eider ducks and others are really declining. Interestingly, we're seeing in total a 43% decline in total bird numbers over the 51 years. 42 species are exhibiting significant declines, but also 33 species are showing increases in abundance. Which is whenever there's change, some species are going to do well, and others are going to struggle. And birds are highly mobile, and so some are moving out, and we do see others moving in. Some of which are conservation success stories where we see bounce back from the DDT era of the middle of last century. So bald eagle numbers are back up, osprey, peregrine falcons, and those are all because of active conservation actions. Similarly with wild turkey here in Maine, it was a species almost extirpated that the state actually reintroduced turkey, and and it's increased all over the state to a point that in some more suburban areas it's become a little bit of a nuisance animal.
You mentioned turkeys, and I live in Park City, Utah, at 6,500 feet. And 2 winters ago, it was a really hard winter, the hardest in 30 years. And all of a sudden, turkeys are showing up. And we've got videos of, a group of 9 or 12 turkeys walking in single file through our backyard, looking at the bird feeder hungrily.
And
But
nature's dynamic, right?
the,
Nature's
the,
super dynamic. It's always changing. And, part of what we need to do is pay attention to it to understand how it's changing. And then what are the implications of that? And are there conservation actions that should be assessed?
Sure. Of those bird species that are increasing in number at Acadia, are they residents or are they newcomers to the park?
So it's both. It's definitely both. Species that maybe were very rare, seldom seen, 4 decades, 5 decades ago, but have really increased. A couple of backyard birds that come to feeders like northern cardinal, tufted titmouse, they've really been kind of working their way north, essentially from town to town and backyard bird feeder to backyard bird feeder, and then expanding out into the forests. And we're definitely seeing that here.
Yeah, we had cardinals when I was a boy growing up in New Jersey, but here in Utah, we don't see them too much at all, actually. Unfortunately, they're a beautiful bird. And species in decline, you mentioned, I think the warbler.
Well, in this was winter birds, this study, so it didn't
Okay.
include those neotropical migrants. But the herring gulls, and common eider, two of the more common species that have shown really strong declines. And then some more northern cold adapted species like the boreal chickadee, which is the northern cousin of the black-capped chickadee that many people know well. It used to be seen very frequently and even nested in Acadia, and now it's a rare sighting in the park.
What do you attribute the declines to? Is it just getting too warm for them, or their food sources are disappearing?
That's a really good question on that. It's one of the challenges in climate change biology, climate change adaptation is that, species responses vary. And so, some species may be responding to the fact that it's not as cold in the winter and they can survive and thus they're moving in. Others may be responding to, changes in food availability, or they may be queuing into other aspects of changing conditions. So it really varies, and unfortunately, there's a lot of opportunity for science and research in this, but not enough funding to make it happen.
What about the Atlantic puffin? Somebody mentioned the other day to me that they're suffering as well. Is that accurate?
They have been. I it's a good question. I don't remember all the details. The last couple of years I think have been somewhat better, but they have been struggling because of a change in the small fish populations here in the Gulf of Maine, and the what used to be the typical species that adults would catch to bring back to the nest to feed their young. That species has shifted its range, and the puffin are catching larger fish, the adults, that the young aren't able to swallow, and so they're starving to death. So definitely some major challenges for that species.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, in talking about the marine life there at Acadia at Frenchman's Bay, you've got these invasive crabs coming in, and what are they doing to the ecosystem?
The crabs, they essentially eat anything. And one of the species they like to eat are the soft shell clams. These are the native clams that hang out here in the mud flats in the intertidal zone and are, actually a really important fishery here in Maine. And the numbers of clams have really been declining because they lack the defenses needed to fend off the green crabs. And so the green crabs just sort of have an all-you-can-eat buffet in the intertidal zone and in the mud flats here. And so those numbers have really, really been declining.
Do you know if they're also feeding on seagrasses?
I have heard that as well. I don't know the details on that, but that is my understanding, and that's been impacting some, restorations of, for example, of eelgrass.
Right. Yeah, I think that's an issue down at Cape Cod National Seashore. So, Nick, looking still kind of trying to focus on the marine waters there, are there other visible impacts that you're seeing from climate change in the wildlife, the marine life that are popping up?
You're talking to a forest ecologist, Kirk, Kirk, so that's just one caveat on this.
Sure.
But certainly, lots of changes in the food chain in the Gulf of Maine, and especially in some of the plankton and the zooplankton, which have cascading impacts on the larger species and marine mammals. Changes in whales, for example, here along the coast of Maine, and populations moving further offshore. There's a wonderful whale watch company in Bar Harbor that does these amazing tours, and they've had to change their tours. They've had to lengthen the time of their tours because their boats now have to go further offshore to see the whales because the whales are moving and as the food shifts.
Wow, that's incredible. Um, 'Cause some people, you look at climate change and it's the long term, it's going to affect us in 50 years or at the end of the century, and it's going on right in front of us.
It is. It really is. We had really big storms here this winter, record sea level and storm surge here twice in 1 week. The Bar Harbor buoy broke the record for the height of the ocean, and just huge impacts from that. And yeah, climate change, it's here and now. People are witnessing it in real time. I like to say in my 25-year career in conservation, we've gone from, not talking about climate change to talking about it in the future tense to now today talking about it in the present tense. And that's how fast changes are happening. if there's a silver lining to this, it's that, people are now much more, I think, driven to respond to it because we're seeing the changes. It's not some sort of mystery out in the future at some point in time, like you mentioned, 2050 or 2100. It's a here and now.
Now, you mentioned you're a forest ecologist. There are some tall mountains for the East Coast in Acadia and in Maine, and you're working on some of the restoration plots at Cadillac Mountain. And it's not a problem restricted to Cadillac Mountain, is it? I mean, there's other summits that have issues that you're trying to address.
Yes. And I know I'm talking with somebody here from Utah, so I'll be very careful with using the term mountain. These
I was being generous.
the high point in Acadia is about 1,500 feet. It starts at sea level, but it's probably more of a tall hill. But you're right. Yes. So the summit areas in Acadia are spectacular, and they've drawn visitors, pretty much forever, but certainly, especially over the last 150 years or so. There's been a lot of human visitation to these summits, and the vegetation in these places is fairly fragile. It's able to handle a pretty severe, weather in these places, but trampling by human feet is something that these plants haven't really adapted or evolved to be able to withstand. And so, as the plants die from being trampled, the soil is no longer held in place by the really extensive root networks that these plants develop. And so the really heavy rainfall events that we're seeing driven by climate change are causing soil to essentially wash off the sides of these mountain summits. And so, we're working closely with National Park Service, with other partners, Friends of Acadia, and others to try to figure out how do we restore these areas and restore vegetation to these areas, given that there's rapid change happening here today. And part of the challenge, especially for every summit except for Cadillac, so Cadillac has a road to the top. All the others you have to walk to the top, and one of the most important pieces to the restoration is bringing soil back to these summit areas. And so at Cadillac, we're able to drive the Cadillac Summit Road to bring sterilized soil back to the summit. For other summits, it's a little bit more of a challenge, and a lot of different techniques were discussed, including using helicopters to get soil up to the summit. And really a realization that there's an amazing network of volunteers here in Acadia that care really deeply about this place and want to help protect it. And so through the work of volunteers, more than, I believe it's 6,000 pounds of soil has been carried up to the summits of in Acadia to help create restoration plots and help mosses and lichens and plants establish once again on those places.
That sounds like a really interesting project, and I'm curious. I mean, uh, how much soil can a volunteer carry? Do you direct them to different summits, and is it something where they're asked to spread the soil or to leave it in one place and then the botanists come in and spread it?
Working with Friends of Acadia and National Park Service on this project, there's a coordinator that this year every Wednesday there's a Save Our Summits soil hike, and volunteers sign up to help with that, and then they carry bags of soil, and there's a limit on the total weight that you can carry up to the summit of these different mountains. And then they're essentially piled in one spot, and then our restoration crews will then establish the restoration plots and put out the soil, put out erosion fabric on top of the soil to protect it, and then some of these plots are getting seeds as well added to them to help accelerate the establishment of vegetation.
Where does the soil come from?
So it's local soil here from Mount Desert Island. It is sterilized so that we're not moving invasive species around. So essentially, it's baked in an oven to destroy any seeds.
Sure. So it's not volunteers, digging a shovel full in their backyard and put it in their pack and hiking up there and
That's
tossing it.
correct.
Yeah, yeah. Is this the first year that that's been undertaken?
We started it last year, and so this is the second year of doing this project, and it's been an awesome project just to see how excited people are to engage in it. And every week there's a waiting list to join the hike because there's more people than we can actually handle as part of the hike.
That's interesting. And you pick a different summit every week?
Yeah, we have been moving around for different sevens. Penobscot and Sargent are the two areas of focus right now.
Yeah, yeah. Now, you'd mentioned earlier the heavy rains that you saw this past winter. Is that impacting erosion on these summits, contributing to the problem?
It is absolutely the heavy rain contributes as the plants die from trampling and their roots disappear, then there's nothing holding in the soil anymore. And as you recall from hiking out here, the soil is not very thick anyways. It's typically a thin veneer over a dome of granite,
Right.
and that thin veneer of soil, established really and formed over millennia, and now it's disappearing in minutes during heavy rain events.
Wow. Wow. Is it something that can be collected and carried back uphill?
It really no, no.
Okay.
That's a challenge. That's yeah. That's why we are using local soil and sterilizing it and bringing it up.
Yeah, yeah. So you mentioned, the Scudic Institute. You're the science partner, so to speak, with the park staff there at Acadia. You must have more projects than staff and funding can tackle. I mean, with climate change.
We do, absolutely so. Yes. I think one thing we get to work with amazing partners here. Certainly the NPS staff are, very much forward-looking and engaged in using science to inform management, also in embracing many ways of knowing as well. So integrating indigenous knowledge, working with the Wabanaki tribes here in Maine as well on co-stewardship. I mentioned Friends of Acadia as a central partner in all of this, and then many others as well. One of our roles at Scudic Institute is to help build a community of science here in Acadia. And there are about 85 research projects happening annually in the park. And so part of our role is to help support those and work together because it's an all hands on deck kind of approach and need given all the change happening.
Yeah, yeah. When I was out there in 2019, I went out with one of your scientists who was conducting research on rockweed, which, to the layperson, it's seaweed, and it's like, what's the big deal? But I learned a lot from that. What other type of science projects can you point to?
Yeah, so you went out with Dr. Hannah Weber, who's our marine ecology director, and yeah, rockweed's the most abundant seaweed in the intertidal, and it's really critical, both at low tide and at high tide for all kinds of species that use it. And so that work continues. I mentioned some of the work in the mud flats with soft shell clams, but also with worms. There are mudworms in the mud flats, which are also a harvested species. That's also really important for.
Fish bait.
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
Is that is
Yeah.
that is that what they're harvested for specifically? There's no other use?
That's a good question. I believe that's a major use of them. I'm
Yeah.
not sure of others, but I think it's the fourth largest, let's see, fourth largest number of permits, fishing permits in the state, after lobster and clams and one other that I can't remember. So there's a lot of work happening on that front, and subsistence harvesting is allowed for those species within the mudflats in the park. So those are some of additional projects. There's more work looking at invasive plant species and what to do beyond just the eradication of the invasive plants and planting natives and whether that can help to slow the reinvasion. And then beyond just planting natives, asking questions about what kinds of natives, grasses versus shrubs, and which species may have some competitive advantages over the non-native species. And so we're doing more research related to that right now.
I've got to ask, the Park Service long has operated under, we're going to let nature take its course and we're going to stand back and watch. And climate change is forcing a different philosophy across the park system. I mean, we saw that at Isle Royale with we're going to bring wolves in because the existing wolf population died out, and we're not having ice bridges that allow wolves to come to the island. And so the moose population is out of control, and the moose population is eating the spruce forest, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I guess my question is, should we basically becoming gardeners or introducing this species or try to recover that species in a national park setting?
That's that's a huge question, Kurt. I think conservation is right. It's a human practice. It's a reflection of human values. I like to say conservation. It's the art and science of protecting areas like Acadia, and it is changing. And I think necessarily so. We don't live under a static climate paradigm. Things are changing really fast and beyond just climate. And so there's big questions on the level of intervention and what's appropriate. And I think in a lot of ways, climate is already pushing on that a hands-off approach doesn't mean no action. It's going to have lots of consequences as well. And I think that's an important piece to recognize that not acting, not responding is also going to have impacts and consequences. And the question is, one of the questions, those could be worse than actually trying to intervene.
Yeah. Before we end this, I have to ask, and I realize you're a forest ecologist and not a marine biologist. What about the lobster population? I mean, people go to Acadia National Park. They might stop at Southwest Harbor. I can't remember the restaurant there where the lobstermen come and unload their catch. Are the lobster doing okay, or is that something that's going to be something we remember?
There's a lot of concern, kind of similar to the red spruce right now. Lobster are doing really well here in this area of the Gulf of Maine. Areas further to the south, like the Long Island Sound, the populations, even southern Massachusetts, populations have declined. And so there are concerns that that's going to happen up here. There's a lot of research happening on that. As you said, and I said, I'm a forest ecologist, so I don't have a great sense for the status on that, but there's great concern. There are other fisheries here in the past. There used to be a big sardine fishery, which is gone. There used to be a big cod fishery, which is gone. And so it certainly wouldn't be unprecedented. But so far it's been well managed. But with the pace of change, there's concerns that management won't be enough to keep the lobster here.
That's Nick Fisichella, the president and CEO of the Schoodic Institute at Acadia National Park. Nick, thanks so much for joining us and sharing your thoughts on what's going on with climate change at Acadia. It's definitely a dynamic time.
Kurt, thank you for having me.
That's our show for this week. We hope you found it informative. As I mentioned in my conversation with Mr. Fisichella, the Schoodic Institute is not part of the National Park Service, but is a nonprofit partner that conducts scientific research that benefits Acadia National Park staff. You can learn more about the Institute and its role at schootickinstitute.org. That's SCHOODIC Institute.org. For The Traveler, this is Kurt Repenchek. See you in the parks.
The composers and musicians at Orange Tree Productions have created a unique collection known as the National Park Series that has grown to include more than 30 CD titles. Composed against the backdrop of a park's sounds of nature, these musical scores will connect you with these beautiful places and take you there, at least in your mind. This collection is the #1 selling National Park audio series in the world and provides the background music for National Parks Travelers podcasts. Visit them at orangetreeproductions.com. Editing and production work for the National Parks Traveler podcast is done by Splitbeard Productions. You can learn more about us at splitbeardproductions.com. National Parks Traveler is a 501c3 nonprofit media organization that provides daily editorial coverage of national parks and protected areas. Traveler's coverage is made possible by reader and listener donations. Visit us at nationalparkstraveler.org.